Viewer discretion advised. Images are used for illustration purposes only.
It was just after sunrise on May 28, 2023, when the stillness of Schenectady, New York, was pierced by the kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. The kind of silence that only follows violence. Inside a modest home on Parkwood Boulevard, a scene straight from a nightmare unfolded. In the early hours of that day, Tishawn Folks Taylor, a beloved mother of three, was brutally stabbed 22 times in her own bedroom. The attack wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was methodical, personal, and horrifying. And the killer? Her ex-husband, Timothy Taylor, a man who had traveled over 700 miles from North Carolina, checked into a hotel, and patiently waited for the perfect moment to strike. But what no one could understand at the time was why. Why would someone commit such an act of terror in front of his own children? And what they didn't know yet was that this wasn't the first woman Timothy had killed that month. This is The Untold Trace, and I am your host. At 38 years old, Timothy Taylor wasn't a stranger to hardship or rage. But those who knew him never imagined he could become what he eventually did. A man accused of killing not one, but two women, each of whom had once trusted him, loved him, and shared a home with him. The timeline begins with the end of Tishawn's life, and the beginning of a national manhunt. That morning, Tishawn's three children awoke to screams. The youngest later told authorities they saw their mother fighting someone. That someone was a man they recognized, their father. But by the time police arrived, Timothy was already gone. He had climbed out through a bedroom window, his hands bloodied, his clothes soaked in crimson. He dropped the weapon somewhere along the way and began walking, shedding evidence like snakeskin. Witnesses later said they saw a man matching Taylor's description, strolling casually down the street, barefoot, holding nothing but a hotel keycard and a small bag. Surveillance footage picked up the rest. He returned briefly to his Schenectady hotel, changed clothes, and then hailed a cab to the Albany bus terminal, where he boarded a bus out of town. It was surgical, calculated, like he had rehearsed it. Back at the scene, the devastation was total. Tishawn was pronounced dead on the floor of her bedroom. Her children, traumatized, blood-spattered, and inconsolable, were taken into protective custody. What officers didn't realize then was that Taylor had allegedly committed another murder just 2 weeks earlier in Brooklyn. That first killing had been his current wife, Teresa Gregg. When investigators dug deeper into Taylor's recent movements, a timeline began to emerge that left even the most hardened detectives chilled. On May 13th, he was already a suspect in the suspicious death of Teresa Gregg. She had been found dead under unclear circumstances in their Brooklyn apartment. Though her death initially raised questions, Taylor wasn't immediately charged. He simply disappeared. 2 weeks later, he showed up in Schenectady. With the second murder now confirmed, the pressure on law enforcement intensified. A man had murdered two women within 15 days. And no one knew where he was until June 2nd, 2023, when authorities caught up to him in Philadelphia. Taylor's arrest was uneventful, but his attitude was far from remorseful. In the interview room, he reportedly confessed to the Schenectady stabbing. When asked why he killed his ex-wife, he gave a reply that would later shake both families to the core. Because she deserved it more. Chilling. No emotion. No hesitation. Just a blunt statement from a man who had taken two lives, each under shockingly intimate circumstances. It wasn't long before prosecutors made their move. A second-degree murder charge was filed in Schenectady. But Taylor's legal team had a different idea. They entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, arguing he was mentally unstable at the time of both killings. For months, the court wrangled over evaluations, paperwork, and motions. But the blood was still on the floor. The children were still without a mother. And a second grieving family in Brooklyn was still waiting for justice. What made Timothy Taylor snap? Why did he travel across state lines with murder on his mind? And how many warning signs had been missed? These were the questions haunting the community, the victims' families, and prosecutors alike. And the horror didn't end there. There was something even more disturbing. He planned it. According to phone records and surveillance, Taylor didn't simply lash out in a fit of rage. He booked a room at a Schenectady hotel days in advance. He took a long bus ride from North Carolina. He waited. And then he crept into the home of the woman he once vowed to love and protect and stabbed her 22 times while her children screamed in the next room. This wasn't passion. It was strategy, vengeance disguised as justice. And it would take the court system nearly 2 years to catch up to the cold truth. Like, follow, and subscribe to The Untold Trace as we continue uncovering this harrowing case in our next section, where we explore Timothy Taylor's past, his broken relationships, and the toxic path that led him to kill. Before the knife was drawn, before the blood soaked through the floorboards, before the children cried out in horror, there was a story, one that began years earlier, far from the final crime scene. It is a story of fractured love, shattered trust, and a man whose anger festered long enough to turn fatal. To understand how Timothy Taylor came to commit one of the most shocking double murders in recent New York history, we need to rewind. Back to when he was just a man trying to keep 2 women in his life while barely holding on to himself. Born and raised in North Carolina, Taylor's early life was quiet, at least on the surface. He attended public school, struggled with discipline, and bounced between jobs as an adult. Friends described him as moody, controlling, and possessive, but never violent. Not then. But his romantic relationships told a different story. By his mid-20s, Taylor had moved to New York, where he met and married Tishawn Folks. She was lively, bright, and devoted to her kids. For a time, they appeared like any other couple trying to make ends meet. They lived together in Schenectady. They had children and attempted to build a future. But beneath the surface, the relationship was deteriorating. Tishawn's friends would later tell investigators that Timothy was emotionally abusive. He kept tabs on her movements. He wanted to know who she was with, what she wore, who she texted. When she laughed too loudly in public, he would get tense. They fought often, and though police reports from those early years are scarce, it's believed that Tishawn left the marriage not just because of incompatibility, but because she feared where things were heading, and she was right to. Their separation was anything but clean. Timothy moved back to North Carolina. Custody agreements were filed, but the tension lingered. He still called, still texted, still tried to control her life from a distance. At one point, he showed up unannounced in Schenectady, claiming he wanted to see the kids. But even then, something in his presence unnerved Tishawn. She reportedly began changing the locks, installing cameras, and telling friends that she felt like she was being watched. Her family urged her to go to the police. She didn't. Instead, she tried to keep life moving forward, working, parenting, and trying to carve a peaceful life out of the chaos that followed her divorce. Then came Theresa Gregg. Theresa was everything Tishawn wasn't: reserved, quiet, and private. She lived in Brooklyn, and when she met Timothy, he charmed her with promises of stability. The two quickly moved in together. Within a year, they were married. To outsiders, it seemed Timothy had moved on. But in private, he was unraveling. Records from family court would later show that Taylor kept both women in his life, reaching out to Tishawn even while married to Theresa. Text messages recovered from his phone revealed a disturbing pattern. He'd oscillate between begging for forgiveness and issuing threats. One message to Tishawn read, "You think you can just erase me? That's not how this ends." Another said, "You're lucky I'm not standing behind you right now." At the same time, his marriage to Theresa began to collapse. She reportedly told a friend she was scared of him, but felt trapped. She had left her own support system to be with him. Now, she was isolated, and he liked it that way. By early 2023, neighbors began hearing arguments, loud ones. One even called 911 after hearing screaming in their apartment. Police responded, but no arrests were made. Theresa insisted everything was fine. That was 2 months before she was killed. Behind closed doors, Timothy was losing control. Unemployed, paranoid, and bitter, he began to believe that both women had betrayed him, that he was owed something, that they had wronged him, and that wrong needed to be corrected. He began crafting a plan. In May 2023, he purchased a one-way bus ticket from North Carolina to New York. But he didn't go straight to Brooklyn. No. First, he went to Schenectady. He checked into a small hotel, not far from Tishawn's house. Surveillance footage from the lobby shows him entering the building, expressionless, carrying nothing but a duffel bag. What was inside? Clothes? A knife? Evidence of the crime to come? Investigators never found the bag. For 3 nights, he stayed in that room, watching, waiting, planning. On May 28, sometime around 4:30 a.m., he left the hotel on foot. A camera on the corner of Van Vranken Avenue captured his figure crossing the street. His pace was slow, calm. He wore gloves. No one saw him enter the house. But everyone remembers how he left it. What happened inside was brutal. Tishon never stood a chance. He attacked her in the bedroom while the children were in the next room. She screamed. They ran in. They saw. Some reports suggest he even threatened one of the children before climbing out the window and vanishing into the early morning fog. And yet, after all that rage, all that bloodshed, he didn't run far. He returned to the hotel, showered, changed clothes, and calmly walked outside. He flagged a cab, told the driver he was going to Albany. The driver later said he was polite, quiet, and didn't seem nervous at all. It was only later, once the crime was discovered, that the pieces fell together. The cab driver, the hotel clerk, the surveillance camera, the children, all of them unknowingly witnessed a killer just hours after he took a life. But the story doesn't end there. While the Schenectady community reeled from the tragedy, another bombshell emerged. Taylor was also wanted for questioning in the suspicious death of his current wife in Brooklyn. 2 dead women, 2 separate cities, 1 man. And yet, the courts still had to ask the question, was he insane or simply evil? We'll let you decide. But what's clear now, as it was then, is that this was no heat-of-the-moment breakdown. This was a planned execution, twice, and the city of Schenectady would never be the same again. Before the screams echoed through that Schenectady home on May 28th, another tragedy had already unfolded, in silence. It happened in Brooklyn, in the apartment shared by Timothy Taylor and his current wife, Theresa Gregg. She never saw it coming. And the world never knew what happened behind those closed doors until it was too late. It's easy to focus on the second murder, brutal, loud, witnessed by children. But what's haunting about Theresa's death is that it was invisible. It slipped through the cracks, a crime that nearly went unnoticed. And had Taylor not killed again just 2 weeks later, maybe it would have. But now we know the truth, and it's worse than anyone expected. Theresa Gregg was quiet, reserved, and rarely shared the details of her private life with others. She worked at a small pharmacy in Brooklyn, had a circle of loyal friends, and mostly kept to herself. When she met Timothy Taylor, she believed he was a man trying to change, a man who had endured a rough past but was looking for redemption. That's how he got in. They married in late 2022, just months after meeting. It was fast, but Theresa, nearing 40, wanted stability and companionship. At first, things seemed fine. Taylor doted on her, offered to take care of the bills, and said he was done with the drama of his previous relationship with Tishon Folks. But as always with Taylor, the mask didn't stay on for long. By early 2023, the cracks began to show. Theresa's coworkers noticed she began arriving late to work. Some days, she wore long sleeves, even in warmer weather. A close friend later told investigators that Theresa confided in her. Timothy had been controlling, jealous, and emotionally unstable. He often accused her of cheating, demanded her phone passwords, and followed her to work. She once said, "He's not violent, if not yet, but I don't feel safe when he's angry." Still, she stayed. Many victims do, and when the fights got worse, she didn't go to the police. She told her friend, "If I just keep the peace, it'll pass." But it didn't. On May 13th, 2023, Theresa didn't show up for work. Her coworkers grew concerned. Calls went unanswered. Texts were marked as read, but there were no replies. One of her friends decided to check on her at the apartment. What she found would trigger a chain of events that ended in Schenectady. Theresa was dead on the bedroom floor. The apartment was in disarray, though not ransacked. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no sign of robbery. Just a lifeless woman, a mess of scattered furniture, and a phone with deleted messages. When the NYPD arrived, Timothy Taylor was nowhere to be found. The medical examiner ruled her death suspicious, but did not immediately label it a homicide. That decision would prove critical. There were no stab wounds, no gunshots, No blood. Instead, there were signs of strangulation, broken capillaries in her eyes, bruising on her neck, and ligature marks. But there was no conclusive evidence of a struggle. No witness, no confession, and no suspect on the scene. Investigators suspected foul play, but lacked the hard proof to charge Taylor. So they labeled her death under investigation, a dangerous pause in justice. While law enforcement hesitated, Timothy Taylor moved, quietly, strategically. He boarded a bus and traveled to Schenectady to finish what he believed he started. In the days that followed Teresa's death, Taylor's behavior was disturbingly calm. Surveillance footage from the Brooklyn bus terminal showed him purchasing a ticket with cash, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. Police would later confirm the trip using metadata from his hotel Wi-Fi login in Schenectady. He arrived May 25th, just 3 days before the second murder. At that point, Teresa was already dead, but no one had been arrested. Taylor knew it, and he used it. While Teresa's friends and family grieved, he was preparing for round two. When he killed Tishon, he knew exactly what he was doing. After Taylor was arrested for Tishon's murder, prosecutors in Schenectady made a critical discovery. As they pieced together his movements, they realized his alibi for May 13, the day of Teresa's death, didn't hold up. Taylor initially claimed he'd been in North Carolina, but bus records, hotel logs, and cell tower pings placed him in Brooklyn that day. More importantly, he had no explanation for the hours surrounding Teresa's time of death. Investigators then revisited Teresa's autopsy. Upon closer analysis, forensic experts concluded she had likely been killed using a soft ligature, possibly a scarf or cloth. They reclassified her case, homicide. Now they had two women, two murders, one man, and a motive rooted not just in anger, but in control, revenge, and premeditation. When confronted about Teresa's death, Taylor's reaction was chilling. He didn't deny it. He simply said, "I felt guilty after the first one. I thought if I did the second, I'd feel peace." That sentence was later submitted as part of his psychological evaluation, one that would spark a heated legal battle over whether he was legally insane at the time of the crimes. His defense team argued he suffered from delusional disorder, claiming he believed the women were plotting against him. They submitted journal entries, including lines like, "They took everything from me, my kids, my money, my name. They turned people against me." But prosecutors fought back with the timeline. He bought the bus tickets, booked the hotel, hid evidence, lied to authorities, fled across state lines. This wasn't the behavior of a madman. This was the behavior of a predator, one who understood exactly what he was doing. As the court prepared for trial, the murder of Teresa Gregg was officially added to Timothy Taylor's list of charges. But the first conviction came from the Schenectady case, where his guilt was undeniable. In July 2025, facing overwhelming evidence and possible life without parole, Taylor took a plea deal. Second-degree murder. 22 years to life. It wasn't justice for both women, but it was the beginning. Teresa never got to cry out. She never got to run. She never got the headlines her death deserved. But now, her story is being told. Because 2 weeks later, another woman screamed, and this time the world heard. If this case has shaken you, help us bring more stories like this to light. Like, comment, and subscribe to The Untold Trace. When Timothy Taylor disappeared after stabbing his ex-wife, Tishon Folks Taylor, in Schenectady, he left behind more than just a blood-soaked crime scene. He left behind confusion, terror, and a city in shock. But what law enforcement didn't know at the time was that they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for a man who had already killed twice and wasn't done yet. The manhunt for Timothy Taylor would stretch across state lines, involve multiple agencies, and end in a quiet corner of Philadelphia. But the path that got him there was anything but quiet. It was the unraveling of a man who had already made up his mind. They deserved it, and he would never be caught. Immediately after the May 28, 2023, murder of Tishon, Schenectady police began piecing together a trail of evidence. Witnesses reported seeing a man walking barefoot down the street. Surveillance footage captured a figure discarding clothing in a dumpster. And a hotel clerk remembered a man checking out with barely a word, leaving behind a cleaned room, but no sign of the bag he arrived with. That missing duffel bag? It would never be recovered. Investigators checked hotel Wi-Fi logs and discovered that Taylor had logged into his email around 5:15 a.m., just minutes after the time of Tishon's estimated death. Using his digital footprint, detectives tracked his next move, a cab ride to Albany, where he bought a bus ticket to Philadelphia. What's chilling is how composed it all was. He wasn't running in panic. He was moving with purpose. By May 30th, police released his photo to the public. At that point, Taylor was officially wanted for second-degree murder in Schenectady. But as news spread, Brooklyn detectives came forward with a bombshell. Taylor was also the prime suspect in the May 13th death of his wife, Teresa Gregg. Suddenly, the manhunt had escalated. 2 dead women, 1 suspect, and a growing list of disturbing behaviors. With media attention exploding, tips began pouring in. Several claimed they'd seen him in North Carolina. One said he was hiding out with friends in the Bronx. But it was a Philadelphia security guard who made the difference. On June 2nd, 2023, in a Greyhound bus terminal downtown, a security guard noticed a man sleeping across 3 plastic seats. He fit the description: tall, thin, hoodie pulled low. Something about him didn't feel right. The guard called it in. When officers arrived, Taylor didn't resist. He stood up, raised his hands, and said only one thing: "I knew this was coming." The arrest stunned both cities. In Schenectady, it brought a degree of relief. In Brooklyn, it opened old wounds. And in Philadelphia, it raised one major question: how does a man kill 2 women, vanish for 5 days, and get caught only because he fell asleep in public? The answer, prosecutors would argue later, was simple. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. Back in New York, extradition was swift. Taylor was first returned to Schenectady, where he was formally charged with second-degree murder. In court, he appeared cold, silent, and unemotional. The judge ordered him held without bail. What came next would be months of psychological evaluations, legal motions, and a battle over his mind. Taylor's defense attorneys immediately entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. They claimed he had a long history of untreated mental illness and that the murders were not acts of cruelty, but of psychosis. They presented writings from Taylor's notebook, scribbled letters in broken sentences. "She was everywhere. Her voice, her lies. I couldn't breathe. They used me, took me, left me, both of them. God told me this wasn't murder, it was correction." They claimed he suffered from delusional disorder with paranoid features, possibly schizoaffective disorder. A psychiatrist hired by the defense testified that Taylor believed both women were conspiring to erase him from his children's lives and financial access. The prosecution, however, wasn't convinced. They pointed to the deliberate planning, booking a hotel room days before the stabbing, deleting texts and calls from both victims, using cash for bus tickets to avoid being tracked, changing clothes, disposing of evidence, and, above all, confessing that Tishon deserved it more. This, prosecutors argued, wasn't mental illness. This was revenge. To further their case, they hired their own forensic psychiatrist. After multiple interviews with Taylor, the state's expert came to a chilling conclusion. Timothy Taylor understood exactly what he was doing. He was angry, he was obsessed, and he believed both women had wronged him. But he knew right from wrong, and he chose wrong twice. In February 2025, after nearly 2 years of back-and-forth psychiatric evaluations, a Schenectady judge ruled that Taylor was competent to stand trial. It was a major turning point in the case. The courtroom was tense. The families of both victims were present. Some wept. Others stared at Taylor as if trying to burn holes through him. The judge's ruling was clear. Taylor may have struggled with anger and narcissism, but he understood the court, the charges, and the consequences. And so the stage was set for trial. But just before jury selection began, something unexpected happened. On July 1st, 2025, Timothy Taylor stood in front of the court and changed his plea. He would no longer fight the charges. No more mental illness defense. No more denials. He pled guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Tishon Folks Taylor. Why? Prosecutors offered a plea deal, 22 years to life. If he accepted, he'd avoid a potential sentence of life without parole. The courtroom was stunned. Taylor's statement during the plea hearing was brief, but shocking. I took her life because I thought it would fix what was broken, but nothing got fixed, and I know I'll never be free again. He never mentioned Teresa. He never said her name, but her family was there, and they didn't need to hear it. They knew. Though the plea only covered the Schenectady murder, Brooklyn prosecutors confirmed that their homicide case remains open and that Taylor is still the prime suspect in Teresa Gregg's murder. The decision to prosecute him separately will likely depend on the outcome of his sentencing on September 16, 2025, and whether the families want to pursue more court battles. For now, Timothy Taylor remains in custody, awaiting sentencing at a maximum security facility in upstate New York. He will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for the families of Tishon and Teresa, justice is far from complete, because in the end, no sentence, no matter how long, can bring back a mother, a sister, a friend. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for peace, it demands answers. Timothy Taylor, the man who had crossed state lines to brutally murder his ex-wife in her own home, now stood before the judge for sentencing. He wasn't wearing blood this time. No red-stained clothes, no crazed eyes, just a man in a jail-issued uniform, calm, collected, and dangerously blank. It was June 2024, more than a year after the murder of Tishon Folks Taylor. The trial had ended. The evidence had been laid bare. The prosecution had been relentless. And the verdict certain. Taylor had already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, avoiding a full-blown trial. It was a strategic move, a plea deal. The district attorney's office had one goal in mind, to make sure this man never walked free again. In exchange for skipping the court's dragging spectacle, Taylor agreed to 22 years to life in state prison. But even as the sentence was read aloud, no one in the room felt victorious. Tishon's family sat in the front row. Her mother trembled as the words were spoken, hands gripping the folded program from her daughter's funeral. A sister wept quietly. An uncle stared daggers through the back of Taylor's head. No sentence could bring Tishon back. No measure of justice could erase the image of her final moments, stabbed in her own bedroom in a home she thought was safe. When given the opportunity to speak, Taylor didn't apologize. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He simply looked up and said, "I had no choice. She made me do it." Gasps filled the courtroom. Not even a trace of remorse. And with that, he was led away. A trail of broken lives. But the story doesn't end at sentencing. In fact, in many ways, it only begins. Timothy Taylor may now be locked away behind concrete and steel, but what he left behind is far worse. 2 destroyed families, 2 women dead under violent circumstances, and a growing sense that something far more disturbing lies beneath the surface. Because while the Schenectady murder case is closed, the Brooklyn case remains open. Teresa Gregg, Taylor's second wife, was found dead on the floor of their Brooklyn apartment just days after Tishon's murder. It wasn't just coincidence. Her death came after Taylor had already been accused of murdering his ex-wife. The details of her demise were grisly, her body discovered in a state that police have only described as brutally assaulted. It wasn't just a quiet exit. It was personal. It was angry. It was deliberate. Yet, as of now, no charges have been filed in connection to Teresa's death. Why? Because Taylor has refused to speak, and without a confession, the investigation is stuck in limbo. The evidence is circumstantial. There are no eyewitnesses, no video footage, and while law enforcement has labeled him a person of interest, they've stopped short of officially indicting him for her death, at least not yet. For now, all they can do is wait. The mental health question. Taylor's legal team initially tried to play the mental health card. His defense argued that he had been showing signs of psychosis, paranoia, and emotional instability for months prior to the killings. In fact, his mother even testified that he had told her voices were telling him to do things. And yet, he was deemed competent to stand trial. The court found no compelling evidence of insanity, no schizophrenia diagnosis, no medical record strong enough to absolve him of criminal responsibility. If anything, his behavior suggested something far colder than mental illness. He was calculating. He traveled across state lines. He disposed of his bloody clothing with precision. He fled using a bus after paying for a hotel in advance. It wasn't psychosis, it was premeditation. And perhaps that's what makes it all the more terrifying. The questions that haunt. To this day, no one can say exactly what caused Taylor to snap. What pushed him from toxic ex-husband to full-blown murderer? Was it jealousy? Rage? A long simmering resentment that finally boiled over? Some say it was control. Tashawn had moved on. She had built a new life. She didn't need him anymore. And for a man like Taylor, that might have been enough to justify murder in his twisted mind. Others believe it was a pattern, a history of dominance, of manipulation, of violence. Tashawn's friends had noted his possessiveness, even years after their split. Theresa's family recalled strange episodes where she appeared bruised, nervous, and unwilling to talk. There were signs, red flags, but no one had connected the dots until it was too late. And then there are those who say it's something more chilling, that Timothy Taylor wasn't just a man who broke, he was always broken. The unanswered ending. Today, Taylor is serving his sentence at a New York State correctional facility. He will be eligible for parole in his early 60s, if he's ever granted it. The families of both Tashawn and Theresa have vowed to fight any attempt at release. They've begun petitions, formed coalitions, and are lobbying for the Brooklyn case to be reopened with renewed urgency. But justice is a slow-moving beast, and in the space between courtrooms and cold cases, families are left with only photographs, fading memories, and aching silence. Theresa's body lies buried with questions still echoing in the earth around her. Tashawn's grave is visited weekly, her name now etched in stone. And Taylor? He lives, eats, sleeps, breathes. Behind bars, yes, but alive. And that, for some, is the greatest injustice of all. If this story shook you to your core, don't let it disappear into the silence. Like, comment, and subscribe to The Untold Trace. Every story we tell brings light to a darkness someone hoped you'd never see. And remember, evil doesn't hide in shadows, it hides in plain sight.